So we had concluded talking a little bit about some of the management implications of cation exchange capacity. And we'd started talking about this kind of wild idea of intercepting the forest residues and pyrolyzing them or turning them into black carbon to incorporate them in the soil to supposedly build soil and increase carbon storage. And we had talked about how this is a pretty neat idea, but that we should probably have some huge caveats associated with this from a total carbon storage perspective, right? Because there's a lot of energetics that's not being represented in this stock and flow diagram. For example, how much energy it would take to actually make the black carbon, and how much energy it would take to actually broadcast it and get it into the soil. So this idea has been gaining a lot of traction, and it's kind of been a movement actually. And where did it all come from? Well, it came from a relatively recent discovery of the Terra Preta, or the Amazonian dark earths. So this idea of creating a super fertile soil in one of the most oxidizing environments on the planet. And not only a fertile soil, but a soil that stays fertile for a long time, so for hundreds of years. And I thought I had this short clip that I'd like to show that illustrates where this idea came from. And I think it's cool because it's relatively new. So your textbook has like half a page devoted to it. And I think now, since the 15th edition of the textbook has come out, there have been whole textbooks written on using biochar for soil management, for ecosystem management. So actually this guy here who wrote this Nature paper is the lead editor of the most recent version of this textbook. So I think by the time the next version of your Bradian Wheel comes out, there might even be a whole chapter on this stuff, because it's super cool. And there's a lot we don't know. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the unknowns and some of the potential that we have for incorporating biochar and management decisions in the future. And then I'd just like to show a couple of cool case studies where we've actually done some field trials where we've been broadcasting this material out in forests of northern Wisconsin. But to kind of preface that, I would like to show this quick clip that does a better job of playing it up than I can do. So hold on, let me. And I apologize in advance, since this is, I do actually have, I have my own copy of this video, but this is actually from the BBC. So they might threaten us with one commercial. So I'll be up here real quick to try to intervene it, but we'll see. It might, when I showed this in class yesterday, it was some ad with Matt Pratt on how to get really buff. So it might be kind of funny. So we'll just have to see how it goes.
This is the story of how archaeologists have uncovered the lost civilization behind the myth of El Dorado. But this was not a kingdom of gold. The secret of the real El Dorado was something far more valuable, something with the power to transform our world.
In 1541, the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana sailed down the Amazon River in search of El Dorado. And although he never found the mythical city of gold, he left a rich testimony of the wonders he encountered throughout the epic journey.
Inland from the river, at a distance of 6 miles more or less, there could be seen some very large cities that glistened in white. And besides this, the land is as fertile and as normal in appearance as our Spain.
But when, a few years later, the Spanish returned to the Amazon in search of the kingdoms Orellana had described, they found nothing. For 500 years, the myth of El Dorado has lured adventurers and explorers into the jungles of South America. Only intensive agriculture produces enough food to sustain large settled populations. But in the Amazon, all attempts at intensive agriculture have led to disaster. The yellow jungle soil is just too poor.
In other words, the forest may look lush, but it is not fertile. The only kind of agriculture the Amazon could support was the kind of small-scale cultivation practiced by many of today's indigenous population. It was thought that the Amazon never had, never could, and never would sustain big or complex human populations. But the question of how they sustained themselves in a region ill-suited to agriculture remained.
It's somewhat difficult to see, but near the top of this low bluff along the Tapajos, we have very dark soil. This is just a very good example of what covers tens of thousands of hectares in the local region.
This black soil, or terra preta as the Brazilians call it, is dotted all over the Amazon jungle. But what intrigued archaeologists is what it contains.
After just a minute or two, I was able to pick up several handfuls of really dramatic pottery sherds. If we can imagine what the whole jars would look like, we'd be rather surprised by these fine works of art.
The pottery they have found is exquisite, and much of it dates from the time of Christ, long before the coming of the Europeans. It was the first hard proof that there had once been an advanced culture in the heart of the rainforest. And when they dug down into the terra preta, scientists made the most revealing discovery of all. Not only was the black soil full of pottery, but it was almost exactly the same composition as the yellow jungle soil around it, except it had been mixed with organic waste. That meant the terra preta had to be man-made.
We know that this terra preta here formed with this soil. So they look very different, and they are very different in a way, but that's the matrix for that. But we have to have human action interfering in the yellow soil in order to create the terra preta.
It was the key revelation. It meant that wherever you find terra preta, there people had once lived. So scientists have started mapping the black soil. And wherever Orellana reported seeing settlements, there they have found it. All along the banks of the Amazon, up the Rio Negro and down the Tapajos, they are finding the terra preta. In all, a massive area, twice the size of Britain.
One problem with contemporary agriculture in the tropics is that one has to put a lot of fertilizers, and very fast, after 2 or 3 years, those fertilizers are washed away by the rain. Terra preta soils, they don't lose their nutrients. They're very stable for over hundreds of years.
We plant papaya, we plant banana, corn, beans, and manioc in terra preta. Whatever you plant in terra preta does exceptionally well.
Terra preta is so fertile that it's been prized by Brazilian farmers for centuries. Somehow, the prehistoric Amazonians had transformed the world's worst soil into some of the best. The prehistoric people of the central Amazon transformed the very earth beneath their feet. From their black soil sprang a civilization that lasted for over 1,000 years. They built towns and even cities that spread across the jungle. But if there really had been a great society here, what had become of it? How could it have disappeared so suddenly?
It's thought that maybe up to 90–95% of indigenous peoples were actually decimated by European diseases to which they had very little resistance.
So what Europeans after Orellana saw when they visited the Amazon was a sparsely populated region inhabited by the few survivors of these devastating waves of disease.
Today, the Amazon rainforest is under threat as never before. Millions of acres are being wiped out every year as farmers slash and burn their way across the jungle in a largely futile attempt to turn it into farmland. The problem is, once the forest has been cleared, the rain just washes all the goodness out of the soil. Often, after just a few years, the farmers have to move on, leaving only wasteland behind. It's one of the great environmental disasters. If millions of prehistoric Indians once lived sustainably in the Amazon, then perhaps we can learn from them. Detailed analysis of the Terra Preta has shown it to be full of burnt plant material, but in a special form: charcoal.
Charcoal is in the area here made largely with earthen kilns, where organic material like these logs are piled up and earthen mounds are built around them, and under partial exclusion of oxygen you get this charcoal.
Charcoal is made when you only partially burn the trees and plants. This makes it different to slash and burn, where the plant life and all the nutrients it contains are completely reduced to ash. This can be swiftly washed away by the rain. But charcoal can last in the soil for hundreds of years.
So one of the hypotheses is that the Amerindian populations actually use some sort of slash and char technique as a soil fertility enhancer.
On this plot we see what happens if we follow the traditional slash and burn technique. After the first harvest already there's nothing growing anymore, and we have here now the third harvest. Here on this plot we applied mineral fertilizer, but that is not very satisfying. If you look on this, there's almost no yield, almost no grain. A family couldn't live on this. That is not satisfying yield. In comparison to a plot where we applied additional charcoal, there we can see that the yield is much bigger. So there's corn. And this is a plot where we applied charcoal and mineral fertilizer. And this combination, last harvest we had an increase in crop production of 880% in comparison to mineral fertilizer without charcoal.
An 880% increase in yield is almost miraculous. Charcoal seems to hold the nutrients in the soil, preventing them from being washed away by the rains. It's a simple trick, but one that Steiner believes could be the key to breaking the destructive cycle of slash and burn, and so reduce the pressure on the rainforest.
Increased soil fertility means bigger crop production, and people can use the same piece of land for more time for more crop production and are not forced to clear a new piece of primary intact tropical rainforest.
And scientists now believe that Terra Preta holds yet one more secret. It seems to have another unique property. something that may once have helped it to spread across the Amazon and could now help it spread across the world. The discovery has been made by Bill Woods. A few years ago, he came across a place where terra preta was being mined and then sold on to local gardeners.
What we have here is a material that is so valuable that people are coming in trucks and buying it. Absolutely unexpected.
With decent soil so scarce in the Amazon, selling the terra preta seems an odd thing for a farmer to do. But here they've been doing it for 20 years, because it appears that the black earth just keeps growing back.
After digging, the soil that's left will grow deeper. It's because it's being fed by the leaves that fall on it. You can see it happening over there and in there now.
The situation is he mines it, he leaves 20 centimeters, he allows it to rest. Then after a 20-year period, the depth of this dark soil is the same as it was before the mining operation. This is extremely important in that it strongly suggests that the material is alive and that the biology of this material is the important thing that we're looking at.
If Woods is right, then terra preta can, in some mysterious way, reproduce itself, just like a living thing. Scientists are now working to find out how it does it. There are literally tens of thousands of species of bacteria and fungi in the soil. And they suspect that somewhere among them must be unique microorganisms that allow the terra preta to grow. The hope is that if they can unlock its secrets, we could reproduce terra preta anywhere. Then we could boost food production throughout the developing world. We could bring a halt to slash and burn. It sounds too good to be true, but the Indians' black earth could one day help to feed the world and save the rainforest. So there is a true irony to the story of the hunt for El Dorado. There was once a great civilization in the Amazon, one the Europeans destroyed, even as they discovered it. But the Amazonians may have left us a legacy far more precious than the gold the conquistadors were seeking. That black earth, the terra preta, may mean a better future for us all.
Well, that's a good feel-good message at the end, hey? So what do you think about that? This idea that the soil is alive. Does it sound like science fiction? What's that?
Do you want me to answer that question?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I don't want to just hear myself talk.
Okay. I think, we mentioned how like in order for soil to be classified as soil, it has to have like organic matter in it and organic, like that's why on the moon there's not soil. So to some degree, it's really not that surprising in the sense of like it living, but I do think it's interesting. I was kind of surprised by how fast the soil was. Like when you look at how horizons develop, things take a massively long time. Like the idea of like a human lifespan, but 20 years is really fast. So I'm wondering if it has like a microbiome that is like attributing to like that fast change, like similar how the earthworms are vastly changing our forest soils.
I'm glad that you clued into that. So I kind of want to call BS on that as well. So 20 years seems vanishingly fast to build 20 centimeters of soil anywhere, right? I mean, that would be a pretty miraculous change. So the science on that is still developing. So that there's a reason why they concluded with that in this video, which this video came out, I think, in 2010. So it's not super current. But I this morning I was looking at the literature and I couldn't find definitive, as you said, microbiome for Terra preta. But I think there is no question that there's a unique consortia of bacteria and fungi that are associated with the charcoal that are making the Terra preta the way it is. So I think it's a really interesting field of study for sure. Any other thoughts or comments about it? I mean, so if they're able to have this massive civilization on soils that are so lousy, you think that there might be some promise of this method to make the lousy soils of northern Wisconsin or northern Michigan at least be able to grow oak trees? I think so. So that there's a lot of interest in this. And furthermore, there's been some really recent research, well, relatively recent, from 2012, 2015, some pretty mind-blowing papers that suggest that charcoal incorporation has been responsible for a lot of the fertile soils that we have in North America as well. So yeah, Sophia.
Sorry, I'm thinking back to the greenhouse management class I took. Like incorporating charcoal into soil is a very dumb practice. How is this different?
In what way is it? You're saying that it's a pretty common practice?
Not always in big commercial greenhouses, but if you're setting up like a bonsai or a terrarium, adding charcoal or even activated charcoal to it is a pretty consistent practice. So I'm trying to branch how this is different.
It's not different. Yeah, so this would be, I'm not familiar with, outside of these examples, I'm not familiar with it being a widespread technique. But I'd like to hear more about that. Is that so? You mentioned Japanese culture, so it's a pretty common thing to do for horticulture. And
I hope it's for production horticulture. I only know about I believe adding charcoal is a common trend.
Well, it should be. It works. Yeah. So that, I mean, this idea, I think this idea has been around for a while. Of course, I mean, if the Amerindian populations hundreds of years ago obviously were doing it, it's I think that the idea is that it hasn't really been adopted in mainstream agriculture, or certainly not in forestry. So I think having this as one of the tools in our tool belt for improving water retention and cation exchange capacity is just starting to get traction in a big way. Furthermore, so I had mentioned the most fertile soils that we have in North America, the mollisols. Remember, we don't have very many in Michigan, but there's been some recent work that suggests that these mollisols are actually, the reason why they're so fertile is because of charcoal incorporation. So this is actually I thought this was kind of a mind-blowing discovery. And this is a recent paper in Environmental Science and Technology, which is a really highly regarded journal in the field of environmental research. And they showed that most of the carbon in the molic epipedon of a mollisol, so these again are our breadbasket soils, is composed of charcoal. And it looks chemically, the chemical biomarkers of the mollisols are identical to the biomarkers that are present in the Terra preta. They don't come out and say it, but what they're implying is that somehow charcoal got incorporated into our breadbasket soils to make them the highly fertile soils that they are. How would that be? They don't come out and say it, but they suggest that this was done by pre-settlement people. So that's kind of a stretch, right? I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, that's a pretty big statement. If you see what I highlighted here, it also show that highly productive grassland-derived soils in the US contain char generated by pre-settlement fires that are structurally comparable to the char in the Terra Preta. So can you take the next leap of what they're suggesting? Yeah, what do you think? Yep. Yeah, I think that that's pretty well known. But the idea that they're actually making charcoal and incorporating in the soil, that I would be really interested. So is that part of Native American stories or culture? Is that something that you guys have talked about? I don't know. I don't know, honestly. Yeah.
Can you get charcoal just by having a lot of burns like that and then having it rain afterwards? So that there's like a lot of.
That's a good question. I mean, when I think of grassland fires, I think of it as the primary mode of combustion is flaming and not smoldering. But certainly, yeah, if you had certain fire weather conditions, you could induce smoldering combustion. But you don't usually think of grassland fires as being like that. You think of really long flame lengths, really fast rates of spread, really efficient combustion, which would create a lot of elemental carbon, but not a lot of organic carbon. So I don't know. I just think this is, yeah, still.
This is somewhat related, but I remember in the video they had mentioned that the civilization in like the crusade they were using saw that people were using I think was it human feces that they were putting into it.
They just said organic waste.
Organic waste. I'm
Yeah.
assuming possibly. Like I think it could be very if one like similar to how like evolution has like convergence and like two adaptations occur separately, not from the same place. I think it could very likely be that if one area of the world had people who found something successful, that in another area of the world it could similarly be done.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason to doubt that it's possible. I just think about, I mean, the mollisols is one of the soil orders of the world, and to think about that they're suggesting that potentially mollisols are one ingredient is human intervention. I don't know. I was a little bit, my mind was a little bit blown by that. Yeah.
I guess it's interesting because it happened so long ago that people like by the time we made these soil orders, right? It was like within the last 100 years, when were the soil orders first defined?
I mean, the soil order concept really didn't come together until Hans Jenny in the late 40s, 1940s. So. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of the implication, and they've done radiocarbon dating of the carbon fraction, and it is really old. So I mean, the char component can persist for hundreds of years. So that's another fascinating thing, is that this was done, obviously, if it was done that way, it was done a long time ago. Yeah, Clara.
Would it be possible in a different environment, like with a lot of trees, to naturally produce that amount of charcoal?
Yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to conclude with that today, is that, you know, charcoal is produced in a lot of different ecosystems, and we have to think about, well, our management right now, a lot of forest ecosystems are fires being excluded from them. So I wonder what the long-term effects are on soil fertility in that regard, because we've done some work quantifying the charcoal content of soils across Alaska and Canada, and it actually can be a significant, at least in the percentage range, you know, so not part per million range, but part per 100 range of the composition. And certainly of the organic carbon that's there in natural systems that burn, it can be a pretty high percentage. And it's not surprisingly, the char content of forest ecosystems is highly correlated with nitrogen retention and the retention of a lot of micronutrients. So if we exclude fire, it could have some downstream consequences that we don't really think about. I just wanted to illustrate that these mollisols in North America are pretty extensive. So what they're saying here is that this incorporation of charcoal, I mean, I think it's a big statement. So that's the history of why we think Terra Preta works. And now, you know, just in the last 10 years or so, we've been really trying to experiment with using it in marginal soils and other ways, not just ag systems, but also in production forestry. So there's been a lot of work done in northern New York, and we're starting to do some stuff in the Lake States. The Forest Service is doing a bit out west. So Deborah Dumrose is a Forest Service scientist who's been leading the charge on this out west. And I just thought I'd illustrate a couple case studies and just show that, yeah, it's been working. I mean, this is a tool that we have in our tool belt. And the reason why it works is the feedstocks that are being proposed to use to make biochar, slash and residues from harvest are generally rich in base cations, and they generally have a high enough carbon to nitrogen ratio that it would make a good feedstock for making charcoal. Oh, and I see that this annoying thing keeps getting in the way. So yeah, if you're interested in this stuff, Deborah Dumrose from the Forest Service, and she's based out of Idaho, has been publishing a lot on this stuff from an applied standpoint. So some other ways that are trying to make this idea more feasible in application is instead of bringing the slash and the residues to a pyrolysis plant and then bringing the residues back to the site, they're thinking, well, why not try to bring the pyrolysis unit to the field and then just generate the biochar on site. So this is called mobile fast pyrolysis. And the Canadians are actually ahead of us on this in generating these methodologies. But here's what one unit looks like. You can see something that could easily be hauled behind a truck. And here's some early work that's been done out of Idaho. This is again in collaboration with Deborah Dumrose. And you can see they did a couple different treatments. This is black cottonwood that they did. They were growing in pot studies. And then they added different levels of charcoal to the soil. So they're hitting the system with a pretty big hammer. You know, 25% charcoal, by mass, that's a lot. So they're really trying to see, well, okay, if we hit this with a big hammer, what kind of response could we expect to see? And you can see here that the no fertilizer, just the charcoal alone, had no effect. And in fact, there was a slight decline in the biomass when they added the charcoal. And the reason for that is, again, and we're just starting to learn this stuff, is that adding just the charcoal, which hasn't been exposed to any nutrients or weathering, is like adding a dead battery to your soil. So it's driving the carbon to nitrogen ratio way up without adding any amendments or any nutrients for the plants to take up. So you have to incorporate the charcoal with organic waste or with fertilizer to actually have it be effective. And that's what some of this early work illustrated. This was some work that was actually done in Michigan, down at the Kellogg Biological Station near Kalamazoo. And they were doing, I believe this is lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta. And you can see that, again, these black bars here, they only really saw the significant effect when they added biochar and urea together. So you have to charge the battery. And I think that the take home from this work that's been done so far is that these are really short-term effects. So I'm unaware of any long-term studies that in a controlled experiment where they've looked at multiple rotations of the effects over time of adding the biochar. I think one of the benefits of adding it is that it persists, since it persists for hundreds of years, the real significant effects wouldn't be manifest until multiple rotations, right? So that I think that's what's remaining to be seen. So it'll be really cool in the coming decades to see how the science on this matures, you know, and if we can actually learn, well, how much should we be applying? You can see in this case, there was no benefit of adding 10% versus the 5%. They achieved the same amount of, statistically, the same amount of improvement at the 5% level. So did you have a question, Rachel?
Yeah. So the charcoal structure box fertilizer.
Yeah, so that study that I showed you before, identifying the biomarkers in the mollisols, they're the carbon structures that make up the charcoal. They're called bridgehead carbons, and that's a fancy way of saying carbon. It's an aromatic structure, and a bridgehead carbon is a carbon that's associated with another carbon. And they suggest that you need 5 bridgehead carbons in the structure to really represent the biomarker from char production. That's in the weeds. But yeah, it's a unique structure that makes it so special. And part of the reason why it's so special, again, is the functional groups that are associated with the charcoal. So a lot of those hydroxyls, for example. So we have lots of negative exchange sites, but also positive exchange sites. And then the structure of the charcoal itself has a ton of surface area. I mean, we know we had charcoal in filters, right? Charcoal is in gas masks, so it's highly absorbent, highly efficient at absorbing even vapors. So that's a great question, and we don't know. I mean, I think part of it is the unique biota. So if we knew what the consortia of bacteria and fungi were that made Terra preta so special, we could potentially inoculate it, and that would probably speed things up. But I think in part it's because of the unique environment that the charcoal provides. It's a nice refugia for different microorganisms. So I think that's got to be part of it. But I would caveat that by saying I don't honestly know. And I also I'm unaware of any of the long-term effects because there aren't any long-term studies outside of the experiments that were conducted hundreds of years ago, by the Native Americans or Native people. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool to say that I don't know. And it's cool that your textbook only has like half a page on this stuff. So like I had mentioned, I've been working with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Sciences, which is also housed in the Forest Service, trying to figure out adaptation strategies for a changing climate. So the National Forest System, we have a National Forest System, the land base that we are charged to manage with. Production forestry is not the #1 goal of our national forests, but we do want to make sure that we have forests, right? So they're trying to make sure that we have adaptation strategies for dealing with drought conditions, drier conditions, and more variable precipitation. And one of the tools that's being investigated is using biochar as a soil amendment. I guess this slide just illustrates that there's a lot of different partners involved in this. So one of the big things that they're concerned about is altered soil moisture environments. And Lewis Iverson, who's associated with the Forest Service, has been mapping the importance value of different stand types and has been doing some predictive modeling, trying to determine with increased soil droughtiness, how important various species are likely to be in our forest systems. So not surprisingly, we know about sugar maple decline. The importance of sugar maple in our forests around here is predicted to decline in the future. So that's being indicated by high importance is the blue shades and low importance is the yellow. You can see that in the future, sugar maple is predicted to be a lower component of our forest systems around here. So dealing with drought and adaptation, one of the things that we want to do is figure out soil amendments, but the other thing is to try to figure out, well, who are the likely winners to be in a drier, weirder future climate? And some of those winners are predicted to be white oak. So that might be something that you consider in trying to manage drought for droughty soils in the future. So I guess, yeah, the key word here is adaptation. We're trying to figure out how to work with the soil so that we can adapt to future conditions. And part of this, again, is this biochar project that we did in Florence County, northern Wisconsin. It's just a timeline, but basically the site was cut and then it was scarified. We added charcoal and we added wood ash, and we had control groups and we added charcoal and manure together in some plots. And then it was replanted. And we've been measuring the growth response of the trees, but initially we were just interested in how these things affected soil physical and chemical properties. So here's an image just illustrating. So this is the first actual field application of biochar that I'm aware of in the Lake States. And so you can see the scale at which we were operating. So we had these truckloads of biochar and truckloads of manure, and we were making admixtures of this stuff. You can barely see the operator in the back there. This is what it looks like when we mix the materials together. This was my my PhD student who was leading the charge on this. And I just wanted to illustrate in the manuscripts that we've been publishing, we've been doing an application rate of something like 1.2 liters per plant. And that sounds really sophisticated and specific, but in practice, it was just because we had these Pepsi cups that happened to be that volume. So that's what we ended up broadcasting. So it was just kind of a happy accident. And then we had planting crews. This planting crew was actually from Guatemala, and they were really nice. Robbie made them brownies and they were really happy. And then here's an image. So we were doing two different types of broadcasts. We do seedling specific broadcasts. So we have just one cup in the hole. And then we also had adapted some skidders so that we could try to spread it more efficiently. It was really time consuming. We did an economic assessment of how expensive it was to do this type of application versus regular planting. And we estimated that it was almost 3 times as expensive. So it's pretty labor intensive. Here's an image of a skidder with our adapted live bottom spreader. So this was a piece of equipment that was actually used for salting roads, and we kind of hacked it onto the back of the spreader and built this hopper out of plywood. But it was actually pretty effective. You can see here's one row that was spread in such a way, and then we'd go through and plant in there. And then, okay, the data. So let's see if I can get rid of this annoying thing. So cation exchange capacity significantly increased with the biochar plus manure. We had a significant increase with biochar alone, but it wasn't different from the manure. So a lot of people would ask, well, why not just add manure then? That seems like a lot less energy intensive than adding the biochar if you achieve the same kind of change in CEC. And the answer is, well, we think that the biochar mixture is going to persist in the environment for a lot longer. So it seems like it's a lot more return on investment. And if what they say is true, this management activity, we hope that this improvement in cation exchange capacity, I mean, it should last for hundreds of years, but it remains to be seen. But we'll be remeasuring, and it'll be interesting to see how persistent this effect is. The other thing I want to illustrate, just because I want us to keep realistic values, ceiling and basement values for cation exchange capacity, 15 centimoles of charge per kilogram of soil, that's miserable. These are really lousy soils. So getting that CEC up to 25 centimoles of charge from 15 or 12 or 18 or so, that was a significant improvement. So that's a really big change. So I think that this management strategy is probably most effective in these lousy soils. It's getting that up to anything better than 18 is going to be an improvement. We also added wood ash, and the wood ash we got locally from the Verso paper mill. So this was a free waste product to us. So the biochar we had to have manufactured out west and trucked here, but the wood ash was readily available, and they actually brought it to the site and gave it to us for free. And it had a significant effect on the pH, which is not a novel finding, but what was new here is actually figuring out how to broadcast it and deliver it in an applied forestry setting. Bulk density went down with the application of the biochar. And you can see the biochar, it had a similar change as with the manure, but again, you would expect this reduction in bulk density to be more persistent with the biochar than the manure. So manure probably will be fully mineralized in a couple of growing seasons, whereas the biochar plus manure should be persistent. Yeah.
Would you say that the biochar favors species that are already back into fire, like pine?
That's a great question. I don't know. So the question was, do you think that the biochar would have a more beneficial effect in fire adapted systems, like pine or black spruce? I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. It seems to make sense that systems that are fire dependent or forests that have serotinous cones, that maybe they would be able, if there was a feedback mechanism built in there, that's an interesting idea. Because the bulk density went down, the volumetric water content went up. So the charcoal has a really high affinity for water. It has a lot of surface area. You can see in this case, we actually had a significant interaction where the biochar plus manure actually had a much greater effect on the water holding capacity than just the manure alone, or just the biochar alone. So that was interesting. That was something we weren't really expecting. So we were also interested in other applications. So a group of students from the Honors College were getting ready to go to Ghana. And their primary project was interested in introducing biochar in some ag systems. But before they went, they wanted to actually try to do some applied projects here in Michigan to make sure that they knew what they were talking about. So we made our own biochar and did some trials in the greenhouse in the biology department. And I just thought I'd quickly illustrate how that worked. So we got some soil from Chassel, actually from Gerke Blueberry Farm, which was also pretty lousy. I mean, it was okay for growing blueberries, but again, remember, blueberries like a low pH and they don't require a very fertile soil. So we got some soil from there and we amended it with fertilizer and biochar on the order of 1% and 5%. We made our own biochar in a highly sophisticated facility called the Burn Barrel. And what I did is I had an inner chamber, and then I just stacked firewood around it. And then I had holes in there. And then as the material inside here heats up, it starts to the non-condensable gases start to off gas. And they actually feed the fire even more. And you can tell when that starts to happen, the fire starts to really rage. It's pretty interesting. And here's the feedstock. So I used Northern Hardwood Slash. So this is what it looked like after it had been pyrolyzed. Pretty efficient conversion. One thing, if you want to make your own biochar, one word of advice is wait till it cools before you open it. So some of these batches, when I take the lid off, since it's made under the partial exclusion of oxygen, if you pop the lid off and it's still 500 degrees, it combusts instantly. So I've lost a batch or two that way because I was impatient and trying to see how it turned out. Wait till it cools before you open it. And we added it to the Chassel soil. And again, this Chassel soil, unamended, had a cation exchange capacity of 7 centimoles of charge per kilogram. That checks out, right? That's our lousy Northern Michigan soil. And we achieved a 30% increase in CEC by adding biochar even at the 1% level. So that's a significant increase with not a very large addition. So that was pretty exciting. And then we grew corn and potatoes in our soils, and not surprisingly, the increase in the CEC, even at the 1% level, had a significant improvement on the biomass. Yeah, Connor.
Did you guys ever figure out why there might be differences in the 5% biochar versus the 1%? Like why the 5% might be lower?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why, I mean, first of all, I tempered that by saying these are not statistically different from each other, but why does that appear to be lower at the 5% level in terms of the biomass? And it might have to do with our ratio of biochar to fertilizer. Like maybe like I mentioned, we just haven't charged the battery enough. What I wish we had done is I wish we had saved the soil after we harvested the potatoes and planted again and tried to do this multiple times. So maybe this effect is something that would only be manifest over time. Yeah. So maybe initially the 1% had the biggest effect, but maybe after the 5th or 6th rotation, the 5% would actually be better. So that's a great question. So again, a lot of these slides that I showed you are all preliminary work. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any long-term studies. So if this is something that's interesting to you, it's wide open. We have more questions than answers at this point. So any comments? I just wanted to illustrate some case studies, and we're kind of next week we're going to transition into the nutrient cycle. So we have 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, and it's going to be primarily focused on the macronutrients and the micronutrients. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So your textbook has interesting ways of grouping the different macronutrients together. So for example, I think nitrogen and phosphorus are discussed in the same chapter or similarly, which in my brain doesn't work because while there is a really active nitrogen cycle, we have atmospheric nitrogen, there isn't really a phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is kind of on a one-way trip to the ocean. And we don't have atmospheric phosphorus, right? So some of these cycles don't really make sense to lump, but we're going to be tap dancing across multiple chapters for that reason. So I've got recommended pages in the reading list that try to cherry pick areas from these different chapters so we don't have to read, you know, a third of the textbook to talk about nutrient cycling. So any questions about anything we talked about today or any comments? So we're going to be kind of changing gears into, so this is how reactive our soil is. And now we're going to talk about, well, what are we actually putting on those exchange sites and why are they important for plants? Yeah, Kendra. That's a great question. So what is the difference between pyrolysis and just combustion? And the movie talked a little bit about that. So it's the primary difference between slash and char versus slash and burn is that burning, the efficiency of burning, well, there's along a gradient depending on how much oxygen is present. But efficient combustion, like would be done if you're really trying to burn a forest, doesn't produce very much organic waste. Efficient combustion, by definition, converts it into inorganic components or ash. And that ash material, while it likely does have a pretty short-term alkalizing effect on the soil, maybe some nutrients are being released as well. If this cation exchange capacity is low, as it is in tropics, then that material is going to be leached out of the soil pretty fast. Whereas in pyrolysis, we have the exclusion of oxygen. Most of the waste, it actually has a high carbon content, much higher organic carbon to inorganic carbon content. Does that make sense? So actually, fire scientists actually measure the atmospheric ratio of organic carbon to inorganic carbon to determine the efficiency of combustion. It's one of the things that we can measure to know if. Sorry? That's right. The more efficient the combustion was. Yep. Any other questions? I guess we're done a little early, but yeah. That's a great question. So do they know how it was done? And I think that Johannes Lehmann had mentioned that they think that they did it by starting a fire and then covering it with soil. That's at least that's how the students were recommending it be done in Ghana. So I think I actually have some pictures of how that was done. So here's one of the kilns that they made, and then they covered it with soil to help it make it go anaerobic. So I think that's our best guess. And I would be really interested to try some of those same methods in a forestry application. So it seems like it would be cool to set a slash pile on fire and then try to bury it with soil or something, try to induce the smoldering combustion. Yeah. Yeah, that's the same idea. So smothering it, it would induce the smoldering combustion. Yeah, I mean, I don't. Now we're getting into specifics. How I know when I'm making the biochar in the burn barrel, I have a K-type thermocouple inside, so I'm actually measuring the temperature, so I can tell when it starts to go down, and I've plotted enough of them out to know when I'm actually done. Effectively just waiting for it to cool down at some point. But you can tell when it stops off-gassing, you can tell just by the rate of the heat of the fire. But that's a great question. These are like these specifics, especially in an applied setting of how hot do you need to get a slash pile to burn before it's time to smother it? I have no idea. That's all open for research, especially the actual application of it. I think that would be a fascinating study. And it would be fun too. It'd be fun to start a bunch of fires somewhere. I worked in the Missoula Fire Lab and I felt like a 12-year-old boy. We were just setting stuff on fire and measuring all the gases coming off and the efficiency of combustion. And it was a really fun project. Any questions in the chat? Oh, sorry, Lily Sparks asks if the exam is on Tuesday or Thursday. And I think the exam is scheduled to be the last day before you go on break. So I think it's scheduled to be that Thursday. And then we'll go over it as soon as you guys get back. You'll have forgotten everything.
You said there's only 2 weeks of class left after next week, or after this week.
2 weeks till Thanksgiving, I think. And then there's 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. And then we have finals. All right, well, thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Well, that's the whole